What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and today we are taking a look at the SkyStars STX225. It is a 225mm do-it-yourself kit here. Now this one comes in at a price of $110 and it is 17% off at the moment. Now I've just done a review on the Tero Q215, which is another do-it-yourself kit, which was just fantastic of a build, and that one came in at $112, and I think it is still on sale for $112. So go ahead and check that one out if you like. I'll leave a link down below. Now that one, the Tero Q215, came with a 4-in-1 ESC configuration, but this one is a little different. This one is coming in with independent ESC, so it is a slightly different build. So the motors are going to attach to the ESCs, and the ESC wires are going to go ahead and attach themselves to the flight controller. And the flight controller is a all-in-one unit. It's got the PDB built into it, so that is pretty nice. So we're going to come back to that in a little bit. Now I've got everything laid out on the table here. I've already put the frame together somewhat, and it fits pretty good. There's a couple of issues with it I'll go over with you in a minute. And here is everything that you get in the box. So let's go over some of the stuff that comes in the box before we hit the frame here. We got the motors here, and the motors are the 2204 2300 kV motors, and it is marked clockwise here with the black screw, and it is by Ken Sun. It is branded by Ken Sun. So, and these are 3 to 5S motors, by the way. So let's take a look at the props that they give you as well. And we got one set of props. They are the Gemfan Wind Dancers 5042 tri-bladed props, and also might as well take a look at this other bag. It comes with some zip ties, battery strap, and a non-slip battery pad. And what you cannot see on the screen, I'll go over it first. Here's some SkyStars stickers, and this is the box that it came with. And I got some of the standoffs and associating nuts and stuff in here. So I got everything kind of put together. So those are the leftover screws that I still need for this build. So let's go ahead and take a look at the ESCs, and they are branded SkyStars 35 amp BLHeli 32 D-Shot 1200 independent ESCs, and they support 2 to 5S input as well. And check it out, there's kind of an LED light on the ESC itself, so that's kind of new to me. And here's the XT60 connector. Now the flight controller is the PDB as well, so we're going to attach the XT60 connector onto the battery pads on the bottom of the flight controller here. And let's see what else we get. We get a bag of motor screws as well, and these motors come with these bullet screws, but they also give you these locking nuts as well, and we also get motor screws. Now we are only given 8 motor screws, so I thought something is wrong. I'm missing some motor screws, but if you take a look at the motor connection on the frame itself, we are only going to be needing 2 screws per motor. So that is something new as well. I've never had a quadcopter build or quadcopter bind and fly unit with just 2 screws holding the motors together, so that's kind of funky. Anyways, let's go over the not the ESCs, but the flight controller. It is a SPC Maker F4 2 to 4S flight controller, and the target is Omnibus F4 SD. I checked it out, and it has got the Betaflight 3.1.7 preloaded on here. It's got, like I said, built-in PDB, and it's also got integrated Betaflight OSD. This build also did not come with any documentation or pinout diagram whatsoever, so I checked online and I couldn't find any pinout diagram as well. So we are going to have to go and do our own pinout diagram, but it does provide you with these little white writings to let you know what each of these pads are, so that is a good thing here. So we'll go and check it out. Hopefully I get everything correct and solder them onto the right pads. All right, so here is the camera, and the camera is a 1200 TV line 2.3 millimeter lens, 1/3 inch CMOS sensor camera, no brand, and I've got the harness already attached to it, and there is a 5 to 12 volt input. There's the ground and the video, so the wiring is correct on this harness here, so we'll come back to that later. And last but not least, we got the VTX, and the VTX is a Cyclone XF, a 5801 Pro VTX, 48 channels, 5.8 gigahertz, switchable from 25, 200 to 600 milliwatts, and the input voltage is 7 to 24, and we also have a smart port as well. Now, it came with this wiring harness, 3-wire attached to the wiring harness. Okay, we're back. I don't know what happened to the screen while it was recording, but it just spazzed out. So here is the harness that came along with the VTX, and it just has 3 wires attached to it. So what I've done was I've added an extra wire to that smart port, so hopefully we'll connect this to one of the open TX pads on the flight controller and see if we can activate the TBS smart audio, so we can change the frequency, the channels, and the power output using our OSD menu from our remote control. So hopefully that works out. So that is the VTX, and that is everything that came along with this quadcopter build. So let's go ahead and take a look at the frame. All right, so here is the frame. I got it all assembled somewhat. The top plate, I don't have it screwed down, so let me go ahead and remove the top plate. So taking off the top plate, and it goes on just like that. And there's the 2 side plates holding on to the FPV camera. Now, when you take a look at these 2 side plates, let me go ahead and remove them from the frame here. Now, if you take a look very closely, you will be able to see that one is slightly different than the other. Well, the one on the right measures in at 2.3 millimeters, and the one on the left measures in at just 2 millimeters. Supposedly, it should be 2 millimeters on both. So what I had to do to make it fit was to hack away at that little groove that the side plates go into. So as you can see, that one's kind of hacked away because the one of the plates is a little thicker than the other one. Yeah, so that's quality control for you. As well as on the top plate, as you can see, that groove is a little bit more wider than the one on the left. So I was able to place the top plate on while the side plates are mounted on there. So on this frame, that is one minus that I'm going to give from a total of 10 points. So we got 9 points on this frame here. And the fact that it only has 2 motor screws holding on to the motors, I've kind of wondered why they only put 3 on some of those, minusing 1. I'm not sure what that is all about, if it's going to decrease the weight of the quadcopter itself, but I would really like to have 4 motor screws holding onto the motor. I think it gives more tightness and stability on the motor mounted to the arm. So I'm going to give it another negative point on this one because it only comes with 2 screws. Some of you might disagree with that, but that's just my opinion. And so we got this nice little build here with the top and bottom sandwich plate with the removable arm, which is just fantastic. It gives it very good strength and rigidity, and the arms are attached to the top and bottom plates via 2 screws, and we got 1 dedicated screw holding the arm only, and we got 1 that's holding the standoff to the top plate as well. Now, the hole that is drilled for this dedicated screw is slightly bigger than the screw itself, so this arm freely moves around just a little bit. It travels back and forth just a little bit, so that is kind of funky as well. So they should have made the hole for this particular screw a little bit smaller so that the screw just fits in perfectly, so it doesn't have this movement. So I'm going to give it another negative point on this frame. So that's 3 negative points out of 10. So I'm going to give this frame build a score of just a 7 out of 10. Anyways, here are the standoff screws holding on to the 30 by 30 stack, and we are also given some holes over here to accommodate a 20 by 20 stack as well. But if you look from the bottom, we are able to access the screws of the 30 by 30 stack standoffs, but we are not going to be able to access the 20 by 20. So you're going to have to put the screws on if you are going to use this particular frame for a 20 by 20 stack build. So that is just about it. And oh yeah, the arms are measuring in at 4 millimeters in thickness, and all of the plates associated with this build are coming in at 2 millimeters, like the top and the bottom sandwich plates, as well as the camera side plates and the top plate that goes on top of it. All right, so let's go ahead and start putting this together. So the first thing we want to do is solder on the XT60 connector to the PDB slash flight controller. All right, so I got the XT60 plug connected to the flight controller, the PDB slash flight controller here, and I am kind of dry fitting the flight controller onto the stack. And what's going to happen is I'm going to put these standoffs, nylon standoffs, on top of the flight controller. And then what I didn't show you earlier is we also get this little plate. It's just been painted over, so this is a non-functional plate, and this is where the VTX is going to be mounted on. And I guess I'm going to be using a double-sided sticky tape to mount this thing on here, and this plate here is going to go right on top of the flight controller. But that causes a problem because the smart wire pad is underneath of the flight controller, as well as the power source for the VTX will be underneath of the flight controller. And the reason why is because, if I can take the flight controller off, there we go. The reason why is because the VTX is rated 7 to 24 volts, and none of these 5 volt outputting power source will suffice that. So when you look underneath of the other side of the flight controller, there's the video in and video out battery pads, in which those two pads right there are a VBAT pads, and there will be the voltage of the input power from the battery. So I'm going to be using one of those pads to power up the VTX, and I've checked the video in positive pad. I'm not getting any voltage out of that. Once I plug the battery in and I do my voltage meter, and I'm checking whether all these pads are giving me the correct voltage, well, I'm not getting any voltage reading from this little positive pad, as well as the positive pad on the video out. The negative pads are functional. However, this 5 volt on the LED pad is giving me 5.14 volts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hook up the camera to this pad right here, but the video VTX, I'm going to be using this pad right here. So I'm getting the full battery power source. So I'm going to have to connect that wire, as well as one of the that smart wire that I need to hook up to one of these T3 or the T6. I'm going to probably use the T6. So I'm going to go ahead and solder on that smart wire to that pad as well. So I'm going to have to do that before I flip this over, place it on the build, and start soldering on the ESC wires, because once I do that, it's going to be difficult for me to flip over the flight controller to solder on those necessary wires. So I'm going to go ahead and solder on the VTX power, as well as a smart wire onto the bottom of the flight controller. All right, so far what I have here is the orange wire coming out of the smart port on the VTX, soldered onto the TX6 pad on the bottom of the flight controller, and also the power sourcing the VTX, the red wire, is soldered onto the VBAT pad underneath of the flight controller as well to power up the VTX. So now I can go ahead and right side up the flight controller and mount it on the build, and now I can go ahead and start working on the motors and the ESCs. Okay, so I've been fooling around with the motor situation here for a little bit, and I found out something that is very odd. This is a clockwise motor, and it has one of those black bullet style nuts, but you will find out that it is not what it seems. So traditionally, we will put the black nutted motors on the left front and the right rear, and the silver nutted motors on the right front and left rear, because the props will be spinning inwards and inwards this way. So traditionally what this would have is the black nut, right? And it will unscrew clockwise and tighten counterclockwise. But this thing, it will unscrew counterclockwise and screw on clockwise for some odd reason. So I tried placing the locking nuts, which are these here, and if I place the black nut on here, it won't fit because it's the opposite threading. So I got the silver nut here, and this nut goes on correctly. Clockwise rotation will tighten it, and counterclockwise rotation will unloosen it. Okay, but aren't we used to motors with the silver nut being in the right front and the left rear instead of the right rear and the left front? So even though this is marked clockwise, it has the wrong threading on the motor itself. So I guess you can do one of two things. I guess you can leave the motor here on the rear right arm and the left front arm, because these will be spinning counterclockwise in order for these nuts to be self-tightening. So what you're going to have to do is put the props on backwards, where it's spinning the opposite way, spinning out, and then configure it in BFIGHT Suite to make sure that it's spinning the opposite way, and configure it in BetaFlight Config tab to have the motors spinning the opposite direction. Or you can place these motors with the silver nut in its traditional spot where the props will be spinning inwards, and configure it in BetaFlight as well. Not in BetaFlight, but you don't have to do anything in BetaFlight, but configure it in BFIGHT Suite to make sure that the motors are spinning this way. All right, so what I have chosen to do is I'm going to go ahead and place this motor on the front right and the left rear with the silver nuts, and the one that accommodates the black nut, I'm going to put it on the right rear and the left front of the quadcopter. All right, so let's get on with placing the motors and cutting the wires to accommodate soldering onto the ESCs. Okay, so here we are so far. I've attached the motors onto the correct arms. I got the black nutted motors on the right rear and the left front, and I got the silver nutted motors on the right front and the left rear, and I've kind of positioned the ESCs kind of around the spot where I want to go. I just double-sided sticky taped it to the arms themselves. It kind of gives them a little bit of insulation as well and keeps them in place while I do the soldering. So let's go ahead and chop up the wires and solder the motors onto the ESCs. All right, so we got all of the motor wires soldered onto each of the individual ESCs here. So the next step would be to place the flight controller on the board itself, and then go ahead and cut up the wires leading from the ESCs to the flight controller and chop them up and solder them on accordingly. All right, we are back, and all of the ESC wires have been soldered onto the flight controller. Not the greatest of jobs, but here is the positive and there was a negative, and the signal negative I just humped back onto the negative for the ESC, and the signal, the white wire, was soldered onto the signal pad on each of the corners of the flight controller. So all we got left now is the VTX harness wiring, which is the negative and the video out wire. That will go to these pads right here on the video out section of the flight controller. And we also have the camera now. So the camera is going to go right here. So we have the harness coming out, and it is long enough to solder onto those video in negative and the positive pads on the flight controller right there, but you're going to have to snip off that part and solder on the wires directly. So that is that, and what we're going to do then is place this little plate right on top of the flight controller, and the VTX is going to be mounted directly on top of it, so the harness will connect to the VTX. So we are good to go. And I got myself an XM Plus, a recycled XM Plus from a different quadcopter, and this is going to the pads on the right. Right here we got the negative, the positive, and the signal pad. So hopefully those are working pads. And there's also a RX1 pad right there. So if this pad right here that is marked S does not work, I can just solder it directly on the RX1 pad. All right, so let's go ahead and solder on all of those wires onto the flight controller. All right, we're back. I got all of the harnesses soldered onto the flight controller. I got my XM Plus soldered onto the correct pads, and the VTX wire soldered onto the correct video out and the ground. Now, I am also learning as I'm going on with this build as well. So what I have found out was the receiver did not work correctly. So what you need to do is, instead of showing it to you on the flight controller itself, I'm going to bring out the photocopy of the flight controller here. So this is what we are looking at. I've got the signal wire connected to the S pad, positive to the positive pad, and the negative to the negative pad. So apparently these three pads here tell what the signal wire is going to be. So what you need to do if you are using S-Bus, you're going to have to bridge these two pads together, and then this pad will work for your signal wire for your receiver. And this positive pad never had any voltage in the beginning, so what you need to do is you need to tell it what voltage you want. You can either bridge these two, which will give it 3.3 volts to this positive pad, or bridge these two pads, which will then give this positive pad 5 volts, in which I have bridged these two as well as bridged these two, since I'm running a XM Plus receiver, the S-Bus. So now I got my receiver soldered onto the S, the signal wire, the 5 volt to the positive pad, and the ground to the negative pad. Now that also goes for the video in and video out as well. In the beginning I did not realize, but this positive pad did not have any voltage, as well as this positive pad. And the reason why they didn't have any positive voltage is because you need to tell them what you want on them. So this is the bottom of the flight controller where there's the video out and video in. So if you want the video in, the camera, to have a 5 volt, you would bridge these two right here. And if you want the VBAT, then you will bridge these two pads here. Same goes with the video out. This is for your VTX. So if you want 5 volts, you will bridge the 5 volt and the middle pad together. And if you want the VBAT power to your VTX, then you will bridge this pad and the middle pad together to give them the full voltage of the battery. All right, so those are some of the corrections and things I'm learning along the way. So I made those corrections somewhat and I left just the way some of them is, and they are working fine. I've connected the camera, I've connected the VTX, and I got the receiver bound to my Taranis QX7, and everything is good to go. And I got all of the motors spinning the correct way. Instead of going into BL Heli Suite and changing the directions, I just twisted a couple of motor wires physically, motor number 1 and motor number 4. I switched those two around, and now I have all of the motors spinning the correct way. So we are good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and put everything back together and see how that works out. All right guys, here we are almost getting towards the end of the build, and I got the VTX ready to get double-sided sticky tape onto this top plate over here of the build. And the receiver, I had to electric tape it because I had to cut off that shrink wrap, and I put a little cutout so that I can see the LED light. And I got the camera mounted onto the side plates, and because of the fact that this plate was a little thicker, I have to use a different screw than the one that came with it because that screw wasn't long enough. So what I ended up doing was I put the same replacement type screw on the opposite side as well. So I have both the same type of screw. And what we are going to do is just place the top cover on here, the top plate, and screw it down. Secure down the VTX as well as the VTX antenna with a zip tie, and secure down the receiver somewhere underneath of the top plate, and we are good to go. So I'll be right back once I get all that done. Alright guys, I'm back and I've got everything completely set up. So I put the top plate on, screwed it down. What I ended up doing was I've placed the VTX on the bottom of the top plate, and the reason for that is because this VTX antenna, if I placed the VTX on the top of the build plate, it was too far to reach to the top plate without getting snapped. It doesn't bend over like so. So if I wanted to secure down the antenna to the top plate, I would have had to gone closer up to the top plate, in which just by double-sided sticky taping it to the top or the bottom of the top plate, it allows me to get closer to the top plate, in which I was able to put a couple of zip ties, one zip tie to hold the antenna up and another zip tie to hold the antenna in place. So there's two zip ties going crisscross over here holding the antenna, because it's a very flimsy antenna. I don't want it whipping around. And so what I ended up doing was putting the XM Plus receiver on that little plate that the VTX supposed to go on, and I got those antennas routed out and put a bigger zip tie over here to secure down the two XM Plus antennas, just like my other build, the Tero Q215, and also in the process hunkered down the XT60 connector as well. Put some electric tape and wrapped around the ESCs. But if you do have some old broken props, cut them into size, place them right on top of the ESCs, and give that a little tape job, so that just in case you get into an accident, your props get bent down and don't hit the ESCs and end up destroying the ESCs. It will hit that piece of prop instead. So I'm probably going to end up doing that a little bit later, but for now I just put a little piece of tape to hunker it down. I've also put the battery strap on, the provided battery strap, as well as the non-slip pad, and I had to cut a little piece off of it. So I think that is just about it, guys. Everything is working. I've tested it all out, and in BetaFlight as well. The only thing that I was not able to get working is that smart audio. For some reason, it does not want to function for me. So I was able to, however, change the channel, the frequency, and the power output with that single button. So I have it set on Fat Shark channel 1, and my power output is set on, there's 0, there's 1, 2, and 3. So I set it on 2, which is the mid power. I believe it's 200 milliwatts. That should be good enough. So all I gotta do now is place the props, the provided props, the Gem Fan, what is it called again? The Wind Dancer 5042 tri-bladed props, and take it out for a spin. So that is it for this video, guys. I don't have enough time to test out the quadcopter. That will be in an upcoming video. So thank you so much for tuning in and watching. Have a great day, and we'll see you again on the next one.